Hello, this is Jeff Segor again, and we're continuing on to our tutorial on how to create a web application using Angular and Elasticsearch. So in this video, we're going to install the major components. We're going to initialize the Angular project, and it creates a bunch of boilerplate files for us, and then we will adapt it. So the very first thing we're going to do is we've got a directory that I've created, Jeff underscore recipes, and under that we're going to create the project called recipes. But first I'm going to bring up my source code editor, and I'm going to navigate, do an open folder to an empty development folder I have under recipes tutorial. Select that folder. This will contain the directory information in here. This is from a previous, I'll take these off. And so I'll take these off too, because when you first come up, you won't have any of this. I'm going to create a new terminal. This allows us to do commands. These are going to be, the Angular is run primarily through the command editor. So what we're going to do is use a command called ng new and give it the name of our project. We're going to accept routing, because we'll show you what that routing is. I'm going to assume that I'm going to be using CSS. I'm familiar with that. And then after a couple of minutes, it's going to create the installation files. Okay, so now we're going to navigate inside that folder. And this is where we're going to use all of our Angular commands to create components. By default, it creates all of these files and directories. The npm, which installs all the modules, uses this special folder called node modules. And so if we open it up, we'll notice that we've got Angular is defined here, and the dev kit as well. So when we start installing some of our other modules like Bootstrap and jQuery and some other ones, material, these will be stored in this folder. In conjunction, whenever anything is installed and we use the -- save, it's going to store this information, the installer information. Basically, the version number of the module is put here. If for some reason we deleted this, because this takes up a lot of space, so if we ever check in this code, we're not going to be checking in the node modules. This can be recreated. You do an npm install, and it looks in this package.json file and installs based on all the information that we have in here, and kind of reconstructs everything and then compiles everything. So what we're going to do is install a few other things. So we've created our new project. Oh, before we do that, we're going to run this so we can actually see what it looks like. So there's a command called ngserve, and it acts as a kind of a test server. So remember, the way these projects work is there's two components, or two sides of our application. One is the back end and one is the front end. When I make this call here, creates a server in the background that the front end is going to talk with. The front end is controlled by Angular. So it's going to go through, it's using TypeScript, so it's actually doing some compiling, and then creates Java behind the scenes. So now this is up and running. It's using what's called localhost, And localhost is similar to a domain name, except it's only for this computer. So if I run this, I won't be able to access this website from any of my other devices on the Wi-Fi. But I'll show later how you can run this off the local network that you have by using a different IP address that's associated with your computer. The 4200, so the way this works is this is like address of a building, the local host, and this is a port number, and that's sort of like a suite number within the building itself. So in order to bring up the web page associated with that, we have to go to this run and debug. Before I can do any run and debug, I'm going to create a launch.json file, and I'm going to use web app option here. And you'll notice here that this thing is using localhost 8080, but we have 4200, so we have to change this. 4200. Now this is a drop down. We've got one configuration here. If I hit this play button, it should launch a web page, and we've got all this information. So this is essentially what is created from scratch. As we're going to delete all this page information and then substitute our recipes app for that. But this gives us something to kind of look and get started with. Plus, it's kind of useful because it has documentation and things like that. So we're actually running on our computer using our browser, using localhost at 4200. Now, what I'm going to do is go through some of these directories. We talked about the node modules being sort of this holder for all of the modules, external modules we add. The launch, you'll notice that the format of all of these is JSON. You'll see that the configuration of launching it, the package JSON for actually configuring the installation, the actual, there's also Angular itself has a lot of directives which determine how you're going to run this, and we're going to be adding to this. Some of the modules that we install will not automatically point to certain files, so we'll have to put it here. So this is kind of equivalent to adding some links within a header file in an HTML page. Any external scripts, like if we wanted to point to a jQuery scripts, we can put it in here. Usually we don't need to do that because we're going through the modules part, but some of the legacy apps have that. So the next thing we're going to do is install this thing called Angular Material. Now this is not npm. I'm going to install. So this is going to add. This is an Angular command. So this is going to add some things automatically that npm may not do. So another thing to be aware of, there's several tabs here. The output coming from the browser itself. So when in our code here in the Angular, if I use, say, a console log, you'll see it in this tab here. Anything that the server outputs will come through here. So this is you'll see more of this when we actually create our own server. But we'll go to the terminal and do a command C to break out of the server. And then do the ng add, and let's see, what was that? Was it at? Yeah, at Angular. And we're going to add Angular Material. Now in this particular case, since we're not using npm, we don't use the -- save. This may prompt us for some questions, which I use the defaults on. Would you like to proceed? Yes. The material is useful for, oh yeah, and I'm going to use, this has some options here for colors. I'll just use the default. And I'll just say yes on this. And I'll include the animations. So now, what you'll see is if we go to our package JSON, it's added these extra modules, animations, and material, as well as modifying our Angular file. So if we now go to, by default, we saw that our style CSS, that's the one that we see, let's see, our style CSS here is automatically put in there by default. When we did the install of the material, it added this. So it looks into the node modules and gets some special CSS style and stuff. So that's what we have here. So the next step is we're going to install the Bootstrap. Bootstrap has some cool GUI components that we can use. I'm going to use this version here. I can actually go to a specific version if I wanted to, or if I just want the latest stable, I would do npm. I is short for install. If I do a -- save, it'll save it to the package JSON file. So we have some records so we can reconstruct it. In addition to that, we're going to take this string and then store that in our Angular JSON file. So from this command line, I'm going to do npm I bootstrap -- save. (109) packages installed, and then it doesn't automatically install like the material did. So what I'm going to do is, let's see where I have that. I'm going to add this string under anything that's CSS is under the styles. And I'll add that. Sometimes the order of this is important. We'll just see if this will work. So I'm going to add the Bootstrap styling in here. Now if we do our ng serve, hopefully it'll compile and not have any errors so far. Okay, that's fine. Do a Command C, and I'm going to install jQuery because there's a couple of cases where I use that. npm does have jQuery, and I need to add this string as well to the Angular JSON file. So npm I jQuery and then I have that string already written out. We'll put it down here. That one is, oh, that one's actually a JavaScript file. So that's going to go into scripts. Run our ng serve, make sure there's no errors. I can find it. Okay, and it should still run. If you go to here, if we're already running, so we actually have this web page that's already there. So since it updates on the fly with ngserve, seems like everything's cool. If we wanted to kill that particular web page, we can do it either by closing that window or just saying stop debugging. So that's debug mode, and the window goes away. So let's see what the next step is. Okay, a little bit of background. On IP addresses. So right now, there's a convenience of testing our code with this local host. But the problem with that is if I want to run this off of my iPad on my local area network, it's not going to do that. It'll only work with a browser on the target machine. So in order to make this thing work on the Wi-Fi, I need to know the IP address of my particular computer. And to get that is you go to command line. So if we do, in fact, we can do it from here since this is a command line. So if I do ipconfig, and this thing will pretty much tell me, if you look at this IP version 4 address, this is going to be the magic number, IP address I'm going to use when I create my own server. So remember this. Also, when we install, we're going to be installing Elasticsearch and Kibana, and they're going to be relying on this particular address to access the database. And so I'm going to show you how, when we install Elasticsearch, how to change the configuration file so that it can be directed to this. So think of this as replacing the home with a real address. Now this address is not available in a public forum. So it'll only work within my Wi-Fi network. To make this public, I'd have to use a public static IP address, which I get when I get my Comcast Xfinity modem and stuff, and it assigns you an address, and then we can do that. That will be sort of a later stage. I do have a public server that I use, and a public IP address, but this is sufficient for now since I'm only interested in accessing here. That, keep in mind, this information we're going to be used in the program itself. Next step. So I showed you a look. Okay, what I'm going to show you before I do that, the code that you saw in that web page is actually defined. We go into source app. Under source, you're going to have two important folders. The app is where all the source code goes, and the assets is where all the sort of the browser side GUI is going to be. We're not going to store the recipe data at this point. We're going to store that. It's going to be in this directory, but it's going to be stored on the server that is invisible to the user. So, but the HTML that's used, if we look at this, this is actually the HTML that brought up that web page. I see all this stuff. So I'm going to get rid of all that. And we're going to replace it with our landing page for a recipe program. There's one string here that I want to keep, and that's important here for routing, is the router outlet. So if I delete that, and then if we go back to ngserve and see if we're not running yet. You'll see it's empty. So all those other widgets and stuff were taken away. It's completely blank, but it's operational. So we're at the 20-minute mark, which is kind of my limit for each of these videos. The next step will be to install Elasticsearch. We're going to be installing the client as well so that we can access the database. And we're going to install Kibana. Now this is added with a new version. It's added a bunch of security, and it's a little bit tricky to figure that out. The security is adding more password token, encrypted token pieces to prevent people from hacking the server side, or hacking the database actually from the outside. So we'll do that in the next video. And until that time, happy computing.